Okay, today we're going to talk about the Victorian Era, roughly 1820 through 1914. In previous lessons, we've talked about the Industrial Revolution causes and the events during the Industrial Revolution. This lesson is basically some major effects of the Industrial Revolution and describing the new type of world that an industrial world is. In future lessons, we will talk about Marxism as a concept, the impact of the Industrial Revolution on Ireland, and comparing the Industrial Revolution in England to the Industrial Revolution in Japan. A couple words we need to know. The Victorian Era, it's basically the Industrial Revolution time in England, named after Queen Victoria, who was queen through most of the actual 1800s. The word standard of living, which basically means an overall measurement of quality of life. And Oceania is basically Australia and the surrounding countries. So we don't say the continent of Australia, we just say Oceania. So the first thing is, what really is the Victorian Era? Well, it is in England, okay, but it's really just the Industrial Revolution going on in the 1800s and the early 1900s. You're going to see the Industrial Revolution go on in the United States along the same time, and on continental Europe. It happened first in England, and basically we're focusing this unit on England, so we'll call this the Victorian Era. 1820 through 1914. It kind of ends at 1914, which is World War I. So I don't know if that's a new era, but that's the World Wars is what I call that era right there. And in a Western civilization sense, we are still in the late modern era. We've talked about that before. And okay, Queen Victoria reigned 1837 through 1901. So you see, it's quite a long time. The bulk of the Industrial Revolution and imperialism, the British Empire, and I don't know, it's named an era because of all the major changes. Just a second. Yeah, an era is a long period with distinct characteristics or changes. So, basically, everything we already talked about, the Industrial Revolution changing things, and what we're going to talk about today are really large enough changes for Western civilization and later the world that this is defined as the era where it got started. A quick note along those lines. Many of the ways of life and how societies are organized started during this time, okay? So if you take life today and you go back to the 1700s, it doesn't seem even remotely similar on how people are thinking about things, how people are living, how people are doing things. You go to 1880 in the cities, and 1880 and 1900 in the cities, and you see a way of life that's very similar and familiar to the current way of life in industrialized societies, okay? So many of these ideas that came about in these ways of living during the Industrial Revolution, we are still living in that mindset in that ways. Of course, we've changed a little bit in how we do certain things, but a lot of the structure and the fundamentals of how we live life today in industrialized United States has its start right here in the Victorian era. So a major shift during this era is a shift in class structures, more so towards the classes you observe today in the United States. And this is a shift mainly because there's a move from the country, rural, to the city, urban. But it goes beyond that, because we have cities for thousands of years, and they didn't have this, this vibrant worker class, middle class. Okay, so also add the fact that there's so many factories and so many businesses hiring many people to get this new class system. So it's not just people living in cities with the economic system of businesses hiring people. So before the Industrial Revolution, it was basically an elite nobility that got their status passed down through their family name and retained a lot of the land. Okay, this is a holdover from the Middle Ages. Most people were just farmers, small farmers, either tenant farmers working for the nobility, or they're owning their own land, or it's a combination. So most people in England were just farmers, okay? And there's a very small 2 to 5% elite nobility, big family names with lots of money that owned lots of land. And of course, there were cities in England, okay? Of course, there were cities, and that's where you would get some specialized workers. But the cities weren't that big, so the majority of people were farmers. There you go. Now, the Industrial Revolution happens, And you got a large percentage of the population move to the cities. The cities grow. The cities, multiple cities, over 1 million people. The whole economy is shifting over to production and business and cities. So what you get is far less farmers. Remember the agricultural revolution, not as many farmers were needed. Many more people living and working in the cities. So you get a huge amount of workers, just laborers, miners, factory workers. You get also a middle class. And these are going to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, bankers, accountants, etc. You get a whole new class of rich business owners, okay? And there's going to be a lot of them, more than the nobility, probably close to or more than the nobility. Now, the nobility are still there. They still own a lot of land and they still got money, but they're going to be now called the old money. They're being replaced by what's known as the new money. Wealthy bankers, wealthy merchants, wealthy business owners. They're called the new money. And they're replacing the old nobility in status and in wealth. So in this new class system, think about it. Status is based upon wealth and education. And that's similar to today. Very few times today in United States society do you say, well, what family are you from? Only a very few families out there hold a family name that is recognizable and immediately imparts status onto the person. Much more in today's industrial world or post-industrial, do you have money? And sometimes it doesn't matter how you have the money. You have money, you have a certain amount of status. Also, do you have education? That gives you status. And now, more so than the 1800s, starting in the 1900s, if you have fame, fame gives you status. But you see, none of it nowadays was based on the old way of your family name giving you status, okay? So the old way is you had the wealth and the education because you were born into a family that had the wealth and bought you the education. Then during the Industrial Revolution, the new way, you have the status because of your wealth and your education. It's reversed it. And if I was to take it, this would be the early 1900s. If I were to take it today, the 2000s in the United States, the amount of people engaged in actual farming has gone, that would be considered farmers, has gone down to so small. Working in middle class, the middle class has expanded and the working has expanded because there's less farmers. There's more rich people now today, that upper middle class to rich. And we also have a new thing, the ultra rich. The ultra rich, the billionaires. And you'll notice the old money, the family old money, they're pretty much gone from society today, only a handful. Okay, let's talk about the change in suffrage. Suffrage means voting and the right to vote. This era, the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, was in Western civilization when people got the right to vote. Okay, so the important things to talk about on this, first I'll talk about it in England, and then I'll mention America for a second, United States. An important thing to note is that it's important to note that literally no one was voting, not literally, before the 1800s, okay? So in the 17, 16, 1500s, to the extent that there was any voting or any voice in the government, it was only like 5% of the men in any country had political power. In like France, the United States, or England, let's talk about those countries. It was only 5% of the men in that country. 95% of the men who are basically farmers or merchants had no political power, and virtually 100% of women had no political power, virtually. So there was basically no voting. There was no universal voting. People didn't vote. It was not expected. People didn't have that right. And then during this period of the 1800s, we get basically in 100 years, we go from only 5% of men, which is 2.5% of the population making political decisions, to 100% voting. So over those 100 years, how it happened first was in England, increasing male suffrage. So like in 1837, there was a Voting Reform Act, and then there kept going more Voting Reform Acts. And each time more and more men got the right to vote. It started with rich men who wanted input in the government, then middle class men wanted input in the government, then the working city people, then men in the farms, then men without property, until finally there was universal male suffrage around 1920, 1918 or so. Okay? And then in the early 1920s, all women got the right to vote in England. And then for the last 100 so years, everyone has had the right to vote. That's England. Now, the United States went along a very similar path Revolution in the United States, 1776. Within the first 15 years or so, only certain men could vote, and then only certain white men could vote. Then all white men could get the vote. Then all men could get the vote. Then in the early 1920s, all women got the right to vote. And then voting was still suppressed for a while. And then in the 1960s and 70s, voting became much more free and universal. But that's more of an American United States history. But it follows along a very similar path of England, although to all my research shows that England never differentiated between colors or races. They just differentiated between male and female voting. Okay, so education really expanded during the Industrial Revolution, right? So it expanded for multiple different reasons. Well, let's start with the fact that a lot of schooling wasn't necessary before the Industrial Revolution because most of the people were farmers. So what is education really going to get you, right? You don't need to learn anything to get a different job because you know you're going to be a farmer because most people are farmers and that's what you're going to be. And so what you got to learn is how to farm. Well, you don't go to school to learn how to farm. You do all your chores and you learn how to farm by helping your family farm, okay? And actually, school and education actually hurts the family because you're not around to learn and help how to farm, okay? I mean, people were educated even when they were farmers back in the day, but it wasn't this thing that was absolutely necessary, and it was done for different reasons. Well, now fast forward into the Industrial Revolution, right? We have many different jobs, middle-class jobs, okay? Many different jobs that would need something that isn't farming or isn't something that could be taught on the job, okay? Technical or tech training. Certain middle-class jobs like banker, lawyer, doctor, teacher. A lot of the new middle-class jobs require a certain degree of educational training. And those newer middle-class jobs tended to pay more than miner, steelworker, laborer. So education became a gateway to the less physical, higher paying middle-class jobs of the Industrial Revolution. And also think about it this way. What else are you going to do with the children during the Industrial Revolution once the child labor laws were passed? Okay? So at some point, the younger children, younger than 10, couldn't work at all, right? They were working, but that was outlawed for good reason. And it's not like they can really help the family. If they were on the farm, young kids can do stuff and they could just be sent out and just ignored, or they can help around the houses on farms, something like that. But what are you going to do in the cities? So they're not allowed to work. And if they go to school, the elementary school, they can start their education and maybe get a middle-class job. And even if they did end up working at age 10, 11, 12, they could work and go to school in some way. And I'm definitely not going to say that the first education was babysitting because it wasn't, but what else were the kids going to do? They couldn't really help to any great degree at home. They were not allowed to go and work for very good reasons, so schooling was a very viable option to improve the kid and use their time wisely. And you can just see that society has really liked this idea of education. It starts with paid education, but then it goes to free public schools. And first it's just the younger kids, but then it keeps expanding. And so the kids aren't allowed to go and work. Child labor is outlawed by ages, and it gets more and more outlawed as time goes by. Expanding the schooling time, extending the childhood time. Society seems to have really liked this extension of education, extending the time of childhood before the kid goes out and gets a real job or gets married or something like that. And so we see an extension of childhood mainly because of those anti-child labor laws and the fact that they have something to do, which is education. And so we see an extension of childhood. People tend to really like it, and we get where we are today. Okay, so for this section, we're going to go into changes in ways of life and mindsets as families, as people, as society shifts from a farming rural mode of operation to a capitalist city-urban mode of operation. For time's sake, I think I'm going to try to keep these brief, but some of these, if not all of them, are some of the most important changes in the mindset. And just because I only say it in one or two sentences, it doesn't mean that fundamentally these changes fundamentally alter the core of how people live. It's really These are heavy. These are heavy. I mean, so is voting, so is education and all that. Well, that's why it's an era. That's why everything in this 120 years is so profound to creating the society we live in today. Okay. This side is when you're a small farmer living in a small farming village. This side is when you're a family living in a city, on average. Okay. Industrial Revolution, city livers, farmers before the Industrial Revolution, England. Okay. When you're on your farm, the family is the own boss. Okay, your family is your boss. You may pay money to the bank, you may have a mortgage for your farm, but no one's your boss. You can't get fired from your own farm. When you're in the city, you're typically working for a boss, working for someone else. This is unbelievably shifting in the brains of humans to give up, to be, let's just put it this way, to be your own boss is unbelievable. It comes with a lot of responsibilities, and it comes with a lot of positives. It is something absolutely different than working for someone else. Some people like to work for other people. Some people like to be their own boss. But there's a major change in the vast percentages of people who go from being their own boss to being workers. When you are a farmer, the workplace is the home. There is no differentiation between home and work. It is the farm. It's where you live. It's where the animals, the crops are. Home is the workplace. Now, in an urban setting, during the Industrial Revolution and today, a vast amount of people go to work. Where's the phrase, I have to go to work? Well, yeah, because the workplace is now separated from the home. Some people like that. Some people don't like that. It wastes time in commuting. For every positive, there's a negative, and you really have to examine what you would like. How has that changed people's mindset? What does it do to the family? What does it do to the mind of people? We're just saying it is a huge shift. On the farm, time does not matter whatsoever unless it's natural time, okay? Your duties on the farm are dictated by nature, and your deadlines are dictated by the animals, the crops, the weather, what you have to get done when because of nature. There's no time and schedules except for when things have to be done because of nature. Now, once you go and you're working for someone in the city, time is money. There's hours you work. It's the punch clock system. You punch in, you work, Industrial Revolution, you work your 16-hour day, you punch out. And to a lot of this, time became super important. There's stories of someone's 2 minutes late. They get docked half a day of pay just for that. Today, if you're working in almost any place, being late is grounds for being terminated and fired. And if you're late, you get yelled at. It is driven by time. We see this in the schools. We see this in the workplace. Everything today is there's a time obsession. And you learned about how the time had to be directly measured all over the country for the railroads to run on time. And it's not a made-up idea. This obsession with time is an Industrial Revolution thing. It was shown directly when England took over India and with the colonizing. And England was an industrial country and India was a non-industrial country. And there was a clash of cultures. Whereas everyone in India, not everyone, but time had very little meaning about when things started or when things would get done. Whereas the English culture, based upon the Industrial Revolution, everything had to be down to the minute. Everything had to be scheduled doing business. And so there was this culture clash. Look, I am not an expert enough on farm children and Industrial Revolution city children. I'm just not that much of an expert. All I know is that the children were more around home, learning at home, on the farm, and they started going to school. Well, after that time, they were forced to work and died at a very young age because of child labor. But once child labor got shrunk down, children in the urban cities go to school. And there's a lot of other differences, but you're going to have to be much more of an expert than I am. But let's just say that's the biggie. Another huge change in mindset that has so many implications and changes on how humans think about each other and how humans live that you've got to literally study this at college for years. I'll just tell you what started it. And then, it's a whole course going into how it changes humans. But on the farm, there's a lot less money. They're producing farm goods, okay? And obviously there is a money in the system, but it's a lot less important. because people are producing farm goods in which they use to survive. And yes, they do use it for some sort of money, but it's not for everything. Now, go to today's world where people work for the money. And in fact, it's actually, unless you report it to the IRS, illegal to do business without money in the United States. You have to report it. And if you fail to report it, the government the government wants you to use money. And so now work is for money, and everything has a money value to it, and everyone's labor has a dollar value. On the farm, it doesn't. Your farm labor doesn't necessarily have a dollar value. It just goes to living and sustaining yourself. But now, time is money, and everyone's time is money, and the jobs people can get is money, and people are working for money. This really changes how people think about things. So much so that I'd like to talk about it more, but you'd spend hours and hours. There's no part of society that isn't really touched by this idea of working for money. Interesting note, cities versus farm villages. There's much less government involvement in farm villages, whereas when you're living in cities of over 1 million people and working for factories and all of that, the amount of government involvement and government rules and government everything is much, 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 much larger in the cities. And finally, in the farm villages, you're going to see the extended families with grandparents, all their children, and all the children's children is much more the norm, that everyone might even live together or extremely close to each other. The family unit is much more of an extended family. This is more of an old school, non-city way to do it. When people switch over to the cities, extended families are still very important. Cousins and brothers and sisters are still very important, but the nuclear family of mom, dad, and children finding an apartment, finding a house, living by themselves and not with an extended, becomes much more pronounced. And that has many positives and it has many negatives. Very, very interesting, especially economically, but economic, social, emotional, many positives, many negatives. Very interesting, the switch from an extended family mindset to a nuclear family mindset. Okay, a big change in the Victorian era, these 120 years of the time, is a rising standard of living and an increasing opportunity, just in general. I guess we could say everything else that we've talked about today is a rising standard of living and increasing opportunity, possibly. Here's just some miscellaneous ones. So basically, life becomes more complex. There's a lot more complexity, okay? And from an earlier lesson, all the benefits of capitalism start coming in. Things move faster. There's more and cheaper goods to buy. There's more variety of foods. There's a lot more money flowing. There's competition to the very heart of capitalism, the competition to satisfy people's demands because they'll pay for things with money. So there's a lot more going on. People are receiving a lot more of what they want. There's increased opportunity because there's increased jobs. There's the opportunity not just to be a farmer. You can be multiple different kinds of workers, multiple different kinds of middle class. Okay, the idea of rags to riches. That's where someone could be born into a working family and end up a millionaire. Well, that didn't necessarily happen a lot back then, but it was an incredibly real possibility to say born into like a working family, like on the poverty line, and then boom, go into a middle class job. It's very easy to move up one step or down one step. Much more education, literacy rates of people reading rose, life expectancy, health was better with, I don't want to say progress, with complexity, with education, with money, with cities. Science goes way up, technology goes way up, healthcare goes way up. So all the sciences are improving really quickly at the same time. So life expectancy is going up at the time. And just all the measures, standard of living, the measures of the quality of life were not steadily, it was a rough start, but then increasing through the Victorian era. So let's finish up with 4 massive global changes that happened during and right after the Victorian era. Okay, so Victorian era, Industrial Revolution, same thing. The Industrial Revolution splits the world into 2 different types of countries, more so than any other way you could judge a country. Now, the most impactful way is to judge them as industrial or non-industrial. That has the most impact, whether a country going in the 1800s to the 1900s was industrial or non-industrial. And even today, the wealth of a country, the opportunities of a country is roughly split on industrial versus non-industrial. And we do have a new type of post-industrial that does even more like computer technology. But we still see a huge disparity between standard of living and a lot of measurements between a country based upon how industrial or how non-industrial they are. So this is when the world became split. And one of the biggest effects of that in the 1800s is the world went through another round of countries taking over countries. And we see the industrial countries taking over the non-industrial countries. So the countries in Africa, the countries in Asia, the countries in Oceania were taken over by countries that had industrialized, mostly by the countries in Europe. Japan took over quite a few countries because they industrialized. The U.S. Sort of took over a couple areas, not as much as the European countries. And we see this as an example of the largest non-landed empire, the British Empire. For a time, the United Kingdom became the workshop of the world. Okay, so in the early 1800s, during the Victorian era, the UK, England, was the workshop of the world. I mentioned that because it's part of the curriculum and I have a document on it. Pretty soon, other countries became industrial, and the British Empire was still great and powerful, but it wasn't the workshop of the world. And finally, the Industrial Revolution, with their mass production, their incredible population growth because of the cities, the incredible wealth, that technology and that mass production and those people were the supply for the next era, the World Wars. So there's no way World War I and World War II could have happened without the technology and just the amount of people and the amount of equipment produced by the Industrial Revolution that was absolutely necessary for the world wars to do their World War thing. So let's see if we got it. Shifts in population from the farm to the city led to social changes, class structure, yep, social changes, yep, family structure, yep, daily lives, yep. Students will investigate the social, political, economic impacts of industrialization in the Victorian era England. Students will investigate voting, suffrage, yep, education, yep, and labor reforms we did in a previous lesson. That's it for the Victorian era and the major changes that happened during the 100 years of the Industrial Revolution. All right, thanks for watching.